From his horrific childhood, which exposed him to drugs and alcohol, to seeing his own struggles in the hopeless misfits of Guardians of the Galaxy. This is James Gunn's dark past revealed. Honestly, it's a miracle that he's managed to get where he is. Gunn grew up going to a school with a serious drug and alcohol problem. I'm not talking about high school, mind you. By Gunn's own estimate, he was just 11 or 12 years old when he got his first glimpse of drug use. What makes it even more shocking is that he went to a Catholic school with a Monsignor running things. In case you don't know, a Monsignor is a senior member of the Catholic clergy. The fact that his school had one just goes to show how religious Gunn's upbringing was. The presence of a clergyman didn't stop his schoolmates from experimenting with illegal substances. His teachers often found kids passing notes to each other about drugs and alcohol. Activities that were explicit in nature weren't off the table. I know what you're thinking. How can 12-year-old kids be into all of that? I mean, where were their parents? Something you need to understand is that the Monsignor, Russell Obman, was the root of all this chaos. Gunn's childhood featured an unfortunately common aspect of religious education, a clergyman who was eager to abuse his power. It's truly shocking to hear what he went through. According to James, Obman frequently took young boys to his office, where he would make them watch porn and drink beer with him. Gunn was fortunate enough to escape the Monsignor's predatory gaze, but just seeing things like this happen is bound to have a lasting impact on you. It didn't help that his parents refused to take him seriously. Apparently, he tried to tell his parents what was going on multiple occasions, but they just thought he was exaggerating. James has always had a wild imagination, so I guess his parents assumed that he was spinning his tall tales. Regardless, Gunn was ignored by the people who should have taken care of him. The Monsignor faced zero consequences for his actions. In fact, he retired comfortably in 1993, and there hasn't been a single public mention of his horrific child abuse to this day, except, of course, by James Gunn. In a way, this kind of explains those inappropriate jokes that got him fired from his job at Marvel. It's hard to forget his shocking fall from grace, especially when you consider how quickly he climbed to the top of the Hollywood food chain. Dark humor is a common coping mechanism, as it helps regain control and recontextualize horrible things to make them seem less traumatic. I'm not saying his childhood excuses his behavior, but you can definitely see why he'd make so many jokes about child abuse. He was likely trying to humorously hint at the very real scars left behind by his own trauma. Going to school and watching kids be manipulated on a daily basis was bad enough, but Gunn also had plenty of violent bullies to deal with. I'd imagine the Monsignor was too busy to care, and that gave some of the meaner boys in his school the freedom to do what they liked. James was the kind of kid that got lost in his thoughts a lot, so it's safe to say that he was no match for these bullies. The torment he experienced, coupled with the rampant drug abuse he was witnessing, not to mention the way his parents failed to protect him, all started to send him down a dark path. James has spoken out about how he was in a dark place as a kid since he felt so alone in the world. In his own words, he didn't feel connected to anyone around him. While he technically grew up in a loving home, the countless traumas in his day-to-day life didn't allow him to let any of it in. The feelings of isolation must have been bad because it's pretty rare for a child to experience suicidal thoughts. I shudder to think of what might have happened. But luckily for him, and especially for his fans, Gunn managed to find an escape in his love of pop culture. It started with horror movies, with Gunn developing a deep love for classic monsters like Frankenstein and Dracula. It wasn't just fun and games, though. James felt an affinity for these creatures. He related to them being outcasts and started to wonder if he was a monster too. Don't just take it from me. This is coming straight from the horse's mouth. It clearly shows the severe isolation he experienced as a child. How else would a kid think of himself as a monster? Eventually, this pop culture obsession morphed into a passion for comic books. According to his brother, Sean, James had tons of boxes of comics lying around, and he wouldn't just passively read them either. Rather, he'd take inspiration from them and try to create his own little stories set in those fictional universes. This would become the seed that'd blossom into his formidable creative talents as an adult, but he still had a long, hard road ahead of him. For one thing, the town he grew up in was absolutely religious. Even something as innocent as reading comics was frowned upon, so James was forced to do his reading in secret. That must have sent him even deeper into his fantasies. Since he was the oldest of 5 kids, he had plenty of actors to play out his stories. Of course, he couldn't live in a fantasy forever. Sooner or later, James had to grow up and find his purpose in life. He already knew how much he loved making stories, so when he got accepted into the prestigious Loyola Marymount University's film and TV program, it seemed like he'd finally put his dark past behind him. Sadly, the trauma of his past was still weighing on him, leading to a long struggle with drug addiction and alcoholism. Early exposure to those kinds of things can leave a lasting impression. It normalizes addiction and makes it more likely that you'll abuse substances as an adult. That's just what happened with James. So even though he was going to his dream college, his addiction kept getting in his way. 2 years into the program, Gunn decided to call it quits, leaving his dreams behind as he moved back to Missouri. James Gunn might go down, but he always gets back up. He managed to clean up his act and began channeling the darkness of his past into art. After a series of films, none of which made much money at the box office, Gunn found himself faced with the opportunity of a lifetime. Marvel wanted him to direct the Guardians of the Galaxy film for them. It was a dream come true for James. Reading Marvel comics saved his life as a kid. The funny thing is, he almost didn't attend the meeting. He'd been pretty discouraged by a string of box office failures, and he didn't think that the executives at Marvel were serious about hiring him. James had told his agent that he was retiring from filmmaking just a week before the offer came, but the chance to direct a big-budget blockbuster proved too tempting to pass up. Now, if this were any other Marvel movie, Gunn might have been fresh out of luck. The Guardians of the Galaxy are a very obscure superhero team in the comics, which is why the film was stuck in development hell for so many years. In anyone else's hands, the movie might have come across as another bloated sci-fi epic. That's the vibe of the source material.
I can explain your very special heritage. Finally get to be the father I've always wanted to be. Excuse me.
However, Gunn was given complete creative freedom, and that gave his unique, snarky humor a chance to shine. The characters went from grim to lovable, without sacrificing any of the high stakes, and Gunn felt especially strongly about Rocket. He kept his backstory pretty similar to the comics, but he also added in something special, himself. James saw a creature that no one understood, a character that had suffered unimaginable torment that turned him into a mean-spirited loner. He knew that he was the only person that could do this movie justice, because no one else could relate to it like he did. Honestly, Gunn felt a personal connection to each member of the Guardians of the Galaxy, and it's easy to see why. They're a bunch of misfits with no place in the universe, with past lives that left them deeply distrustful of others, yet they find hope in each other against all odds. Towards the end of Volume 1, Groot sacrifices himself to save his friends.
No, Groot! You can't. You'll die. Why are you doing this? Why?
And he signs off with a slightly different version of his iconic line, "We are Groot." Only a man who resonates with the struggles of these characters could have come up with that. A man like James Gunn. So from the way his past allowed him to relate to the Guardians of the Galaxy, to the traumatic years he spent at a school full of drug addicts and alcoholics, this was everything you needed to know about James Gunn's dark past.